Lance was 39 when he was diagnosed with dementia. As his dementia and memory loss progressed, I needed to continuously adapt to those changes. And the reason for that was it made him more comfortable, which made him less agitated and less stressed out. And that just made it easier for me to care for him.
When I met you and you were willing to open up and share just a little bit about Lance's decline and how he had changed over the years, I just really appreciated your candor and just your willingness to share that experience because I've always been fascinated by the human brain and how it works um, when it's growing and improving and developing, but also when it's declining. It's absolutely fascinating to me. Your experience in caring for him was, in essence, a mirror of the effect that the dementia had on his brain. Like it was happening to him, but you were experiencing it on your end. So this is a very interesting topic to me, and I think a lot of people are going to appreciate just your honesty and your willingness to share very candidly about how not only how it affected Lance, but how it affected you as well.
Well, I said in another episode about how it fascinated me to see what was going on in his brain. That was something that I felt all along. It really made me sad too, but I've also always been interested in the brain and how it was so crazy to watch these changes in him. He was so intelligent, and to see the things that he did, the way that he reacted to things that just didn't make any sense to me. And so I've also said that I was living in his world. And so I adapted to whatever he needed. And that just gave us so much more peace. I guess I feel like I tried not to live in denial of what was happening. I wanted to deal with what was there in front of me because I wanted us to live the best life possible. And it wasn't his fault that he was sick, and it wasn't his fault that these things were happening to him. And so by me making the changes that made him more comfortable, it helped us both. So I just kind of want to talk about some of the things that I did, some of the changes that I made that just made him more comfortable. One of them was my hair. I have naturally curly, naturally blonde hair, and I wore it that way for many years. But then by the time his dementia had progressed about 5 or 6 years into it, I had already been straightening my hair for a while. And then I decided to dye it dark brown. And he looked at me one day and he was so confused. And I asked him what was wrong. And he said, I can't remember your name. And I reminded him who I was. And he said, that's right. But you always had blonde, curly hair. And I realized then that I needed to go back to the blonde, curly hair so that he would instantly recognize me. And we have talked about the scrubs in another episode too, that I wore scrubs for a while because that was something that even if he didn't recognize me, he recognized that I was wearing scrubs, and that signaled to him that that was someone who was taking care of him. Another thing was we'd been living in our house for about 10 years, and I wanted to paint it, and it was brown. The outside of it was brown. We lived in a subdivision with covenants, and everybody's houses were pretty, I think most of them were some shade of brown. Sometimes there was green in there. But anyway, I was sick of brown. Other people were painting their houses other colors, and I was so excited. I was like, ooh, maybe I could paint it something completely different. And so I went and I got some paint samples, and I started asking Lance his opinion. And he said, I really think that we should keep it brown. I would hate to come home and find that I didn't recognize our house. And I had never thought about that before. And I'm really glad that he was able to say something like that. And then I started noticing that he was not recognizing our friends' houses in the neighborhood because they had painted their houses a different color. And it was that way for the rest of his life. He didn't remember where anyone else lived. Our house was the only one that he recognized because I kept it the same color.
His ability to articulate something that indicated that he understood his own decline. So his own level of self-awareness, and then being able to articulate that to you is really crazy. Like
Right.
there are a lot of people that don't have dementia that aren't able to do that. So that's pretty interesting that he had that moment of clarity to understand that I'm not always going to see things this clearly, and then to be able to articulate that to you is wild.
And that was one of the things I think that made people not believe me when I would tell them that he had dementia or that he was as sick as he was, because he was able to fool people for a long time.
Well, and his stories, in fairness to the average bystander or onlooker, his stories were very believable. He was very convincing. So there is that.
That's true. That is true. He was a good storyteller. Another thing that I did was, I was his primary caregiver for more than 12 years, and I needed help. I couldn't do it all by myself. We used home health services, but I also there were times when I needed to take a break, when I just needed to get away for a couple of days, or I just needed to stay home and clean the house because I didn't get things done when he was there with me, because he was my number one priority. So I used nursing care facilities for respite. And I would put him in there anywhere from 5 days to 2 weeks at a time. And like I said, I would either go out of town for 2 or 3 days, go visit my best friend, or most of the time I would just stay at home and get my house cleaned up, because it always drove me crazy how disorganized it would get and how much clutter we had. But because of his dementia and memory loss, I worried about putting him in a home. And so we finally found a place where he felt comfortable, where the people treated him well. And I felt really good about leaving him there. Of course, there was never any place as good as home, but this place was good enough. And I was worried, because his memory loss was getting worse, that he wouldn't remember this place when I would take him back, because I only use it for respite maybe 2 or 3 times a year. So there were a couple of veterans, younger veterans, I think they were in maybe their 40s and 50s, that had MS, and they lived in this care facility. And he became friends with them during one of his respite stays. So I started taking him there to have lunch with them once a week, so that this would become part of his routine, so that hopefully it would be part of his memory, and he would get to know the people who worked there, and they would get to know him, and he would be more comfortable. And that turned out to be a really good thing for both of us, because he didn't like going and staying there. He always wanted to be at home, but he understood. I always explained to him why I needed a break. I was burned out for so many years. And so he was good about going there. I would check on him daily. If I was staying in town, I would still visit him every 2 to 3 days, depending on how long he was staying there. And then it also became a good place for him to go after he'd been hospitalized, if he needed inpatient occupational therapy, physical therapy, he could stay there for a week or two, and then he was comfortable there. So that was another thing that turned out to be a really good thing for us. And I'm so glad that I did that, because I used them for probably about 4 or 5 years. And that was very helpful for me during that time. One of the other things that I did was I used Post-it notes for everything. His memory loss was so bad. The last 3 years of his life, he couldn't remember something that happened more than a couple of minutes ago. So I would write everything on Post-it notes, and I had them all over the house. I carried Post-it notes in my purse. I carried them in the car. If I had to get out of the car, say I was putting gas in the car and I had to run into the gas station really quick, I would write a little note on the dashboard and leave it on the dashboard, so that he would realize that I had just gone inside and we'd be right back so that he didn't try to get out and come and find me. But those post-it notes were a lifesaver. I used those all the time. I went through a lot of post-it notes. One of the hard things for me, though, was I couldn't reason with him. And that's something about dementia that always bothered me, was not being able to reason with him. And the last few years of his life, I just got to the point where I just said everything was my fault. Everything's my fault. Oh, you know what, Lance? I am so sorry. That was my fault. I messed that up. I'll take care of it. And then it was just gone. It was, there was never any kind of a confrontation. There was never any kind of frustration on his part. But that did have a psychological effect on me. I walked around feeling like everything was my fault all the time, even though, logically I know that it isn't, but what you tell yourself becomes true. So I ended up having to get a counselor to talk through that. That was probably one of the most challenging things for me during his years of dementia.
So I want to say, because I was thinking about this when you were talking about the post-it notes. It's fascinating that he never lost his ability to read. So that all the other decline, the things that you lose, that he could read right up to the very end, correct?
Yes, he could read, but he would have to read short stories or just a few paragraphs, because by the time he got to the end of something that was too long, he couldn't remember what happened at the beginning of it. There was something really funny that happened with the post-it notes, and I remember this. This was when he was on hospice. His counselor had come over to the house and just wanted to visit with him and see how he was doing. And we sat out back, and I left them sitting out back outside. It was a nice summer day, and I got him back in the house, and I said, I'm going to go out and talk to your counselor before he leaves. And I wrote on a little post-it note, I'm outside talking to your counselor. I'll be back in a few minutes. And I stuck it on the handle of his, he had a handle that he used to sit down in the chair. And if I stuck a post-it note on there, it was a signal that he shouldn't stand up because there was something in the way. So I left that post-it note there, and I went out, and I ended up being out there for 20 minutes, which was not like me to do that. I never left him alone that long. But I came back inside and I said, I am so sorry. I did not mean to be outside that long. And he said, that's okay. I knew where you were because you left it on the note, but the part about you being right back was a lie. And it surprised me that he remembered how long I'd been gone, because normally 2 minutes, I don't know. It was just, it made me laugh, though. That's something that still cracks me up when I think about it. It was a lie.
Do you remember, I'm sure you do, the very first time that you realized that he didn't know who you were? And then like how did that affect your relationship with him?
I do remember there were a few times that he would call me by the wrong name, and then he would look at me and he'd go, sorry, that wasn't right. And he'd remember instantly. So I knew that something was happening. But the first time that he really did not recognize me was that time when my hair was straight and brown. And that was when I realized that something was really changing in his brain. And it made me feel even more protective of him, because I could see how vulnerable he was becoming. And I saw that that was a little bit of a fearful thing for him too. So it made me even more protective of him. I was already protective of him, but then it just made me, I don't know. I was super protective of him. You know that.
Yes, I do. As well, you should have been. Like, who else was going to protect him? It was you.
Yep, it was me. And I don't regret it. I mean, I got a lot of grief from people. I got called names a lot for how fiercely I protected him. But if I had it to do all over again, I would do the same thing because he died knowing that nobody was ever going to hurt him if I could help it.
That's pretty significant. So in talking about changing your hair specifically, it made me think like that was a change that you made. And so then that made me think like, how did you feel about making such a significant change? Was it something that you liked, or did you just do it for his benefit?
I would say that was the only reason. I didn't really want to make any of those changes. There was another thing too where at some point I had to stop wearing clothes with patterns on them. It bothered his eyes. I would come out dressed in whatever I was wearing for the day and he'd say, "Can you go change?" I thought, I don't like that shirt. The pattern bothers my eyes. And so I stopped buying any clothes that had patterns on them. And that goes back to I was living in his world. I did these things to make it more calm and peaceful for him. And that made it easier for me because then he was calm. But it was never anything that I wanted to do. To me, it was always a sign of another loss. It was a sign of decline for him. And it was a sign of me losing my identity because I was becoming who he needed me to be.
How did you work through that without becoming resentful toward him?
That's something that I don't feel like I ever resented him for any of that stuff. There was nothing that he could do. It wasn't his fault. I mean, I guess I just kind of thought about it logically, tried to leave my emotions out of it. Of course, it was an emotional thing, and I would talk to my counselor about that. But when you sit and you think about the reality of the situation, this is what we're dealing with. I couldn't reason with him. He had dementia. So I just had to make the changes that needed to be made to make it peaceful in our home.
I think that speaks a lot to how focused you were on his comfort and his benefit. It's not always the case that the person providing the care has the other individual's best interest at heart. I mean, we see a lot of situations in the world around us where those parents or caregivers are self-centered and self-focused, and they hurt their loved ones. They don't care for them. And I just think that the way you approached caring for Lance, it really demonstrates that you were interested in him being comfortable, in him being happy, in his life being the best it could be, that you were able to take yourself out of it and focus solely on him. And you've been such an inspiration to me. And I can't help but think that you were an inspiration to plenty of people around you, because the fact that you weren't resentful toward having to make such significant changes to you and your personality, you were willing to lay down your own life to make his life better, I think is it's such a good example of, I think, really what it takes to really care for someone the best that you can. So good job.
Thank you. Um, it, all the things that I did, yes, I did want him to be comfortable and I wanted him to be happy and I wanted him to have the best life that he could have. But all of those things also made my life better because we were faced with a situation that we could not change. There was nothing that we could do that was going to make him better. There were only things that we could do that would keep him comfortable, keep him plateaued for a while, I guess. But there was nothing at the time, there were no treatments that were going to make him better than he was. And so that was what I had to work with.
And that sounds like you did the best with what you had. Oh, I'm proud of you. That's all. You did well. I want to ask you about maybe a little bit more lighthearted perspective on caring for someone with dementia. And due to the dementia, were there things that he did that further endeared you to him, that made you love him more? Little things that you saw that you would never have seen had he not walked through that? Was there anything like that that is a little maybe sweet memory that you keep in your heart?
Oh, there are lots of moments like that. He had become so childlike and he was just so sweet and so vulnerable. And I, on the one hand, it would make me really sad. But on the other hand, it made me just love him so much more and just want to protect him that much more. And it also made me think about, I wonder if this was what he was like when he was a child, because he was just so precious and so sweet. And I don't know, I have so many photos of him just looking like a sweet little kid, and so many videos of him too, talking about things, and just reminded me of a child.
I can remember you telling me that he would scare you because he would call you in from the other room with like such urgency that it scared you as if something was wrong, and you would rush in only to be told, "Hi."
That, or there's a speck of dust on the floor right there in front of the TV. Can you get it for me, please? Like, really? That couldn't have waited until I got back here like 2 minutes from now?
Oh my gosh, I love that. Were there things that occurred as part of his dementia that maybe caused you to feel more angry toward him, that you had to work through? And maybe not toward him, but sometimes when maybe you're angry at the disease, or maybe you're angry at the condition, but you can't, there's nothing to embody that. He is what was embodying that. And so it would be easy for your anger, your frustration, your whatever negative thought patterns to be directed at him. Did you ever experience that? And how did you work through it?
Yes, there was a time. It was early on, it was before the dementia diagnosis. Lance and I, from the beginning, had this great relationship. We always communicated things, we laughed, we worked things out right away. And he was becoming very mean and he was hateful towards me. And he would just say the most awful things. And I had no idea where it was coming from. He was just lashing out at me. And I kept telling his medical team that these things were happening, but he was only doing it to me. And he wouldn't do it around anyone. He only did it when it was just the two of us. And I couldn't get anyone to listen to me. And it took about 2 years. And we ended up having a domestic dispute, which this whole time just crushed me, because up until that point, he had never even raised his voice to me. He had never said anything mean to me. If he was teasing me and it upset me, he would stop instantly and say he was sorry, and he would never say anything like that again. So the way that he was treating me was so horrible, and I couldn't take it. And the fact that nobody would believe me, and I was really angry and resentful towards him, because I felt like he was doing it on purpose. I didn't know what was going on because he wasn't showing this around anyone else. And then about 2 years into it, we had that dispute, I said, and they finally did neuropsych testing on him and discovered that he had some deficits. And I think what was happening is that he knew that there was something wrong, but he didn't know what was wrong. And nobody could tell him what was wrong. And so I was the safest person for him to lash out at. But I did resent him for probably about 4 years. That there was a period of time where I just wanted to leave every day. And then when we finally got to the point where we got him medicated, and he stopped being angry and mean, I was able to look back on it and see what had happened and what needed to change. And really, I was the one that had to change. I was the one that had to adapt because he couldn't most of the time.
I think the bottom line is that the able-bodied person, the one that is of sound mind, has to be willing to make the adjustment. They have to be willing to make the change because the other person is no longer capable of that. And it's the same thing that I see as, and I just relate it to what I know, which is parenting. But it's the same thing when you decide to bring a child into this world, you are deciding to give up parts of yourself for that other person. You have to, because they need you 100% on day one. And that does reduce some, but they need you a lot. And just the way that Lance needed you in an increasing amount, right? It's like you had to give up more and more and more of yourself as the disease progressed. I think that's the best advice, is just be willing to make the adjustment, be willing to make the change that will help your loved one be more comfortable and be able to walk through that with peace. Like that's what you said. There was peace in your home when you made those changes. So that made it worth it.
Right. But it did take time and effort to make those changes. It wasn't something that just happened overnight. And it was really hard. And I did go through the resentment and I did go through all of that stress getting to that point. And it still wasn't easy. It still was very, very difficult, but it was easier because I was willing to make those changes.
I think additionally too, it's worth noting that it wasn't a one-time choice. That was a continuous willingness to make that choice each day. And I'm guessing sometimes multiple times a day, that you had to recommit to that over and over and over again. Did that ever change?
No, it was like that from the time I made the decision until the end of his life. That's how it was. And that's how it needed to be because I was living in his world and it wasn't his fault. And that was one of the things that really helped me get through it, was continuing to tell myself it's not his fault that he got sick. I think that's something that we can end up getting mad and blaming the person who's sick, but if you sit down and you really think about it, if it's not anything that they did, how could it possibly be their fault? And that's how I tried to look at it all the years that I cared for him. Anyway, well, thanks for joining me, Jenna. I hope that this is another helpful conversation for people, and I will see you next time.
All righty, we'll see you.